Move to the first session this morning, which I am going to be chairing, and I have the great pleasure of introducing to you Professor Corinne Fowler. Professor Fowler in Colonial and Post-Colonial Studies at the University of Leicester. She's based in Museum Studies. She specialises in the legacies of colonialism to heritage, literature and representations of British history. She co-edited the 2020 interim report on National Trust places, connections to colonialism and historic slavery. This incredibly important report was issued at a time of heightened social tension through the Black Lives Matter movement, and you may all be familiar with the backlash and media attention it received from the political right wing. Corinne is a former teacher. She directed a child-led history and writing project called Colonial Countryside, National Trust Houses Reinterpreted 2018 to 2022, in an attempt to better understand Britain's slave trade past by seeking to make historic houses connections to the East India Company and transatlantic slavery widely known. Her most recent book is Green on Pleasant Land, Creative Responses to Rural Britain's Colonial Connections, and her book, The Countryside, 10 Walks Through Colonial Britain, will be out this time next year. I had the pleasure of spending the evening with Corinne and senior museum representatives, colleagues earlier this year, and we discussed with her critical research and reports and the professional and personal challenges that she has faced in the wake of it. So I'm delighted to introduce her to you today. Corinne is going to, I know, and I'm confident she'll be giving a very fascinating, insightful, thought-provoking and informative keynote address. Thank you very much.
I'm not very tall, so I don't know if you can all see me at the front. I'll try and move away from this a little bit. Okay, first of all, I'll probably be wearing my mask quite a lot during this conference because my father is one of these vulnerable people that can't afford to get COVID. So for people like him, it is permanent lockdown. So I feel very sorry for those people, and I know there are many of them. So I want to talk about sensitive histories, and also to say that this issue is not just a professional matter. It's very much bigger than ourselves, our jobs and our institutions and organisations. It's a long-standing issue, the issue of colonial history and how we remember it. And it involves a lot of historical amnesia and also intergenerational struggle. It's been going on for a very long time. So I really want to ask in this talk, where do we stand in our various roles and what is our role? And I believe that we are very much here through research rigor and evidence basis to resource public discussions about and understandings of colonial history, and also to serve in very conscious and hopefully emotionally intelligent ways. It's important to think about the educational dimension of this issue, and education about empire in particular you might describe as a kind of miseducation or a massive omission in our own experience of education in the British Isles. And I mean, my experience of secondary education and primary education about this issue very much tallies with what other people tell me. So I remember doing the Tudors, well, before that, the Battle of Hastings, and then skipping to the Tudors, and then skipping to the Industrial Revolution, with people nodding in the audience, with the colonial dimension very much missed out, and then skipping over to the World Wars. So I think there's actually quite a few people nodding, and this is obviously a problem because there's a glaring omission in that. And I have heard a lot recently in conversations about this topic, because obviously the government is talking about having a model curriculum in Westminster, but that yes, we do, and we have always had an extensive education and thorough education in colonial history. And I think that's an interesting but very contentious claim, partly because for anybody over 50, there was no national curriculum in the UK. It wasn't taught until 1989, so it was very much up to individual teachers and schools. And the content has hardly been helpful thereafter. So I think it's a really important issue. And I've got this slide up because it was an article, I don't know if you saw recently, by Satnam Sanghera, who wrote the Sunday Times bestseller Empire Land. And he did, I don't think he thought of the title, Was the British Empire All Bad? I think that was the newspaper that put that one up. But his whole article is about this balance sheet approach to empire, saying, well, there were good things about it and there were bad things about it, and that's how we should teach it in schools and so on. And he, first of all, asked the very important question, well, who judges what was good and what was bad? And also that understanding in its full complexity and variety and historical variation and whatever, this history is really, really important to understanding multicultural Britain and its origins and various dimensions. But he also points out that it does not advance historical understanding at all to take this balance sheet approach to empire. And he says it's like finding the good and the bad into kind of two columns like this, which is what some teachers are doing at the moment, I've seen. And not that I'm going to criticise teachers, because teachers have had a brilliant response to this, by the way. He said it's like defending the morality of kicking an old man in the shins one afternoon because you fed a stray cat in the morning, which I quite liked. Anyway, when he wrote this article the other week, he then got his usual vitriolic response with loads of horrible letters sent into the Times and a hail of hatred, as he always gets. And so I then, and a couple of us, wrote letters to the Times. And I've got a succinct version of my letter. You have to get it into 150 words or something. But this is just part of my letter, where I said, successive governments have failed to incorporate basic facts about colonialism into school lessons. To check this claim, readers only have to ask their children, grandchildren, or even their peers what they know about the Royal African Company, the East India Company, and the Opium Wars. And then I've missed out a bit. Neither does it advance historical understanding, as I just said, to make subjective judgments about whether the British Empire was good or bad. Sanghera is right. Such judgments will inevitably be shaped by our relationship to that history and what we were taught or not taught about it. And then, as if to prove this point, the next letter, which I absolutely love the placement of this letter, is from Nicholas Best saying, Sir, Kemi Badenoch is right to argue that children should learn the positives about the British Empire as well as the negatives. I grew up in colonial Kenya and have long since wearied of people who weren't there telling me that I'm wrong about the British in Kenya when they are the ones who don't know their stuff. Satnam Sanghera implies that the majority of imperial historians are ignored and vilified as woke by the Conservative government. What about all the historians who are howled down if they try to point out the benefits that the British brought to empire? So I kind of rest my case. My own education also about colonialism and Ireland was non-existent, and that's really important to say, and I'm looking forward to learning more. But it's also a question of unlearning, or lifelong unlearning, if you like, when you are sort of educate yourself about this subject. And I've been speaking a lot to history teachers over the last couple of years, and more recently about this proposed model curriculum by the Education Secretary using this balance sheet approach. And teachers have many, many concerns about this. And one of the concerns is a safeguarding concern. that it's to do with you can stunt children's intellectual and emotional development if you withhold information that is very important contextual information for understanding how our society is as it is. So you can also do harm by not being properly trained or not fully understanding the issues or teaching it in ways which are humiliating or traumatizing for those pupils. There's also a question of transparency. Now, who is going to be on this group which decides what this model curriculum will be? And of course, there's always the issue that in any case, any academy, of which there are many in the UK, can opt out of any model curriculum, and also so can private schools. It was mentioned at the beginning, thank you, so I don't need to go into it too much, about the National Trust report on its country houses connections to various aspects of the British Empire. And it's important to say that all that report is, despite the fuss, is an audit of peer-reviewed research by loads of historical experts to show what we know so far about National Trust houses and to bring it all into one place. And this work came partly out of my project Colonial Countryside, which was also mentioned at the beginning, which is working with 100 children across England and Wales. And it's a child-led history and writing project, which is sort of more or less coming to an end. There was a lot of fallout, as was alluded to this National Trust report, because it came out partly at a very sensitive moment, and it was subject to, I would say, not exaggerating, massive attack. And it's been going on for over a year, but for some months it was particularly intense. And I just want to show you some examples of some of that wonderful coverage by really responsible journalists. I think one of the reasons why the National Trust report alarmed the government so much is that the National Trust has a massive platform. They've now got nearly 6 million members. Their membership has increased, note, not decreased. And it's a very big platform, but it's not under the control of the government because it's an independent charity. So this was really terrifying to the government because it was an opportunity to actually inform people about British colonial history. And there were some immediate and quite dramatic actions by the government. There was some parliamentary action. So you can see a picture of Jacob Rees-Mogg there talking in Parliament about how the National Trust report is denigrating British history and denigrating the memory of Churchill and so on. And lots of cabinet ministers did actually get personally involved in this issue, sort of briefing against the National Trust report and so on. But there were also 2 debates held in Parliament about the National Trust report, one in the House of Lords, one in Parliamentary Hall. And also there's now been a new parliamentary group set up by Andrew Morrison, the MP, without inviting the National Trust, about the National Trust. Anyway, so it's still going on, and that was only set up recently. Now, when all of that didn't work very well, there was an attempt to investigate the National Trust using the Charity Commission. So the Charity Commission investigated the National Trust for bringing out this report and supposedly bringing the charity sector into disrepute. When someone did a Freedom of Information request, they found that there were only 3 complaints, and on that basis, this report unsurprisingly vindicated the National Trust for researching its own properties. But anyway, the next tactic was really to present any historians in this area, and me in particular, as enemies of the people. And you can see some of those enemies of the people articles here. It's a sort of part of a smear campaign as well. So you see that picture there with the bird on my head? That was taken from my Facebook page from behind a wall by a very nice journalist of the Daily Mail online. But you can see here some of the articles on the bottom left in the Times. National Trust accused of bias in study of colonial history. It didn't say who was doing the accusing, and then that came out in the Daily Mail online. National Trust is accused of recruiting biased team of academics to probe its properties links to empire and the slave trade. And this kind of carried on. You can see also the Telegraph article. There were a lot of opinion pieces, and opinion pieces are the things that often really do damage, because people can say stuff because it's an opinion, but it's in a newspaper. So it looks like news, but it's actually someone's opinion, and that's how people get away with it. They've got these massive platforms. And Simon Heffer there in the Telegraph, the yellow one, said, I've read the National Trust report, and it's a one-sided take on history full of woke prejudices. And he also questioned the intellectual heft of its editors, and said that, also mentioned it was nearly all women, and picked us all off one by one, but didn't mention the sole male editor of the report. Anyway, one of my favourite ones ever is the far right one. The Guardian asked me for an interview, so I gave them an interview in very measured and reasonable terms. And the headline a few hours later from the Daily Mail Online is she gaslighting us? Historian behind project to highlight National Trust's imperial ties launches extraordinary attack on ministers for weaponising history by trying to stop left-wing academics denigrating Britain's past. Anyway, it went on and on and on and on and on like that. And so I've obviously looked very closely at this, and I want to learn more about culture war, its origins, its how it operates, how it functions, and so on. But the characteristics I've kind of summarised here, I hope will be useful for anyone doing this work. First of all, the chief actors in this particular culture war is a group of 56 MPs and peers called the Common Sense Group of MPs, and a number of cabinet ministers. There are also a few key columnists, a very small number of columnists who do a lot of damage across several platforms, newspaper platforms. They're mostly older men, and they have a huge influence over newspaper editors, and there are often coordinated media attacks. And the point about this is not something, it's not about trolling people on Twitter. I think we can all handle that. These are massive platforms that people have, and they draw a lot of toxic anger in your direction and put you in all kinds of danger. And it's very much, I've described it before to you as like, you're on the pavement, you've got every right to be on the pavement, but it's like a juggernaut coming at you on the pavement. The other characteristic of it is misinformation. So there's a liberal use of inaccuracies, and it's very difficult to reply because you don't have the same platform. And I think that the misinformation is often knowing and deliberate, but there's a feeling amongst those who are perpetuating it that the ends justify the means because they're protecting Britain's history against attack and so on. That's the way that it's often presented and justified, because nobody wants to identify as a bad or a corrupt person, obviously. The tactics I've tried to summarise here as sort of denigrating and dismissing anyone sort of doing the work. I showed you the picture of me with a bird on my head. You know, obviously that makes me look like a, very strange person. There's a sort of dynamic of them and us and enemies and people that we have to defend ourselves against. There's a lot of backroom intimidation that goes on behind the scenes. There are smear campaigns. There is a deliberate attempt to exploit the education gap between different groups of people. There's a lot of gaslighting. And there's also the arm's length principle, where the government's not supposed to be uncomfortably close to publicly funded museums and so on, which is being endangered. And also in academic terms, the Haldane principle is being endangered. So for example, the 56 Common Common Sense Group MPs went to my funders and told them to stop funding me and not fund me again in future, because it was a political project, not a research project. So, I mean, this is really, really serious stuff. And then the other dimension of this is that it's very much a culture war which has been imported from the US, but it has quite strong UK elements, which I'll kind of come back to in a moment. And the characteristics of this, it's associated with the rise of nationalism, populism, and so on in Australia, Europe, and the United States particularly. And the targets tend to be primarily people of colour, but also women and women academics and other professionals as well. The concepts there I've kind of briefly summarised. You'll be familiar with them all: cancel culture, free speech, and rewriting history, not in the positive sense which we as academics understand it, but in terms of distorting the historical record or making stuff up. So my book that I'm writing at the moment, it is fully a response to this. The most constructive response that I could come up with from my experience of studying and understanding what's going on. And it's called 10 Walks, it's called The Countryside, 10 Walks Through Colonial Britain. And I'm walking with 10 different people who have ancestral connections to empire and a strong relationship with the countryside in particular regions of Britain, and having conversations, not arguments, about what that history means at a human level. And here you have pictures of two of my walks. Graham Campbell on the right was just partly responsible for Glasgow apologising for its slavery past. He's an SNP councillor. And then Charlotte Williams on the left wrote a book called Sugar and Slate about her own connections to empire and Wales's connections to empire. And that book has never gone out of print. Another person I walked with recently around the Whitehaven coast is Pete Carlew, a novelist. And I asked him about his relationship to the countryside, because he's the one person I'm walking with who has, he's less keen on the countryside than all the other people who I'm walking with, who are pretty much rooted in it. And this was his response. I thought it was a really interesting response. He said, the African continent was robbed and the fingerprints of the English countryside are all over the crime scene. No amount of warm beer, nuns on bicycles and thatched roofs can obscure that. So I always keep my hand on my wallet when I hit the green hills. It's brilliant, Pete Carlew. And that's a reference to John Major's speech about what England represents and his idea of the countryside. So we were walking along the Whitehaven coast, and I thought this particular walk might be of interest in the Irish context, because the Whitehaven coast has got coal seams that run all the way along it, and the coal was exported from very, very early on in the 17th century to Ireland, to Dublin, across the Irish Sea. And so when I investigated the history of Whitehaven, because what I'm trying to do is to bring out the unique colonial histories of every place that I walk in, and they are all completely unique. I found that there were 7 families that dominated that area, and they are the Lowthers, the Lutwidges, the Gales, the Jeffersons, the Kerwins, the Christians, as in Fletcher Christian of the Mutiny on the Bounty, and the Senhouses, and they all had significant East India Company, Royal African Company, or tobacco interests, or a combination of all, across the generations. And there was generally more than one type of colonial engagement as well. And all of these families were important landowners, developers, manufacturers, traders, exporters, They were magistrates, sheriffs, and a lot of them worked in custom houses as well, for very good reasons, because they were busy exporting and importing stuff. Now, this is a painting of Whitehaven in 1686. And as I say, the main story that gets told about Whitehaven, although there's some attempt to tell the fuller story now, is the story of coal, because it is a very, very important history. But the thing about the shipping routes is fascinating, because obviously this northwest England, and then you've got the Irish Sea. And at that time, the sailing over the top of Ireland was a brilliant way of escaping all these hostile French and Spanish ships. It was a brilliant transatlantic route. So that is why the coal export business turned into a tobacco business as well, that people started looking elsewhere. So tobacco is a major story of Whitehaven. And you can see there on the right-hand side, someone smoking tobacco with one of these clay pipes, which I'll talk about in a moment. So sort of all during this period that I've been talking about in the 17th century, in Virginia and Maryland, which are very strongly connected to Whitehaven, there was an attempt to grow really good quality tobacco. And it was even used as currency. It was known as brown gold. It's like notes, like dollar notes. You could use it in that way and pay for things with it. And there were quality issues at first. So plantation and the growers were really keen to create something which was a good quality product. And when they finally got the right type of tobacco, they relied very heavily on indentured labour, and that was working people transported over on ships to work on these plantations in clearing land and creating these plantations in the first place. And there was a lot of concern expressed in Whitehaven that people who were needed locally were being shipped over to work on these plantations in Maryland and in Virginia. But the planting process was so labour intensive, you had to clear all these trees, and it was just really, really massive work that a lot of people were needed for it. So getting back to Whitehaven, the tobacco trades became more and more important, and the customs house demanded, the customs officers demanded a larger house for the increase of our plantation trade, they said. And Whitehaven became Britain's second largest importer of tobacco between sort of 1700, but before that, and up to about 1770. And there were lots of secondary industries because of that. So there was a pipe house created in the town in 1699. There was tobacco processing and so on. And with all these profits, the tobacco merchants reinvested their money in things like glassworks, ironworks, a sugar house. There was Muscovado sugar processing place, in rum, which they imported from the West Indies, snuff making, and there was also an issue with access to Whitehaven. The roads were really poor quality in winter, and if you were riding along on a carriage and a horse came by, in some places you couldn't actually pass each other. So these very important families got together and they were asked for a turnpike road, and they commissioned it. And once again, every single family that commissioned that road and put their money into it were involved quite heavily with colonial trade in one way or another. If you see a picture of the harbour there, you can see there's an inner harbour and an outer harbour. And the inner harbour was for coal ships, and the outer harbour was for deep-bottomed transatlantic ships. So there was a lot of tension between the tobacco merchants and the coal merchants, because there were limited resources to build these these facilities, but eventually it resulted in this construction. And there were also an important slave trade from Whitehaven. I'll give you an example of one of the earliest on the slide, Walter Lutwidge, who built the local lighthouse. He commissioned the Whitehaven galley, which went to Jamaica with enslaved people and then came back with a load of indigo and sugar. And thereafter, there were many, many voyages from lots and lots of different ships. There was the Griffin, the Peace, Prince George, all these were making multiple voyages. Neptune, Jane, the Howard, the Providence, the Betty, Unity, Whittington, the Black Prince, Nicholas, King George, the Happy, Diana, Peggy, the Tiger, and the Elizabeth. And it's often said by historians that this was a fairly insignificant trade, but there are some really grim statistics. If you do your maths, all these families that I've mentioned with a few extras, they actually trafficked a minimum of 5,739 Africans. And they were responsible, in addition, for the deaths on the Middle Passage of at least 906 people. So call that insignificant if you like, but it was actually the 5th largest slave trading port at the time, for some 50 years or so. There's also a really significant African and even Indian presence in Whitehaven, along the Whitehaven coast. And I've just given you a couple of tables. I've top and tailed these very long tables showing this presence. So from over a period of about 100 years, in the local church of St. Nicholas, there are 61 African and Indian people listed as being buried, married, baptized, and so on in that church and in other local churches between 1686 and 1785. So I think it's really important to think about how places like Whitehaven have been historicised, and to speak about coal and tobacco and slave trading and all the secondary industry. It's all part of the same picture, which is sort of unique. Now, if you, the Whitehaven coast, I don't know if you know, belongs to the National Trust. And this is actually what the National Trust says about it, and I want to just read the whole description. Only 5.5 miles from the border of the Lake District National Park, this coastline stretches south from the 18th century harbour of Whitehaven towards the sandstone cliffs of St. Bees Head. The site of England's first undersea coal mine, Whitehaven had the deepest mines in the world by the 1730s. The last working pits here closed in 1986. The local community has succeeded in securing the funding to open it as a museum to Whitehaven's mining heritage. For wildlife lovers, the best time to visit is May to July. The thin, spoil-tipped soils grow a colourful carpet of wildflowers. At the RSPCB reserves on St. Bees Head, puffins, guillemots and razorbills join thousands of seabirds nesting on the tallest sea cliffs between southern Scotland and northern Wales. We have partnered with the RSPB, Natural England, the Land Trust, Cumbria Wildlife Trust and the local councils to join up how we care for our colourful coast between Whitehaven and St. Bees. And it's really typical of this sort of tendency not to tell the fuller story, partly because it's not known, but it's an opportunity to tell that fuller story. There's a lot more work to do, is what I'm trying to say. I'm also walking in beautiful Dorset, and I was tempted to walk along the Jurassic coast, but actually I decided to go a bit more inland. There are some really important slave-owning families in Dorset, the Beckfords, the Pinneys and the Draxes and so on. And the person I'm walking here with is called Louisa Adjoa Parker, and she's a poet and a writer. She writes short stories as well, and she's written this poem about when she was working as a maid in this guest house in Lyme Regis, and it's called Sometimes When I'm Making Beds. And this is just part of the poem. She says, "I could be an African girl brought back 2 centuries ago from Jamaican plantations by a trader, my master, his mulatto child, in fact." And she says this because there is a local history of exactly that. There was a group of enslaved people brought back by a local plantation owner. So I'm walking with her, but I think it's really interesting how she reimagines herself as an historical figure. And there are a couple more lines in the poem where she tries to point out the continuities between them and now the legacy of all this. She says, "Little has changed here up at the big house, pretending I was born for this, smiling and dusting and cleaning white people's rooms." She's an expert in rural racism. She grew up in this area and she's very interested in the local historical roots of all that. So we're walking in Inland Dorset. We haven't actually done the walk yet. We're doing it next month. But there were about, after the 1833 Abolition Act, there are about 53 claims from Dorset addresses for plantations all over the West Indies. And we're starting at this place called Charborough House. I don't know if anyone has been to it. It's not owned by the National Trust, it's owned privately, Charborough Estate. And one of the people who owned it was called John Samuel Wanley Sawbridge Earl Drax. A bit of a mouthful. And he married into the Drax family, who owned plantations in Barbados and Jamaica. And in a claim that was made in 1836, he received money for 189 enslaved people at Drax Hall Estate. And with that money, he made some improvements to the house, including one of the longest, if not the longest wall in England, which goes all around I think it's 2 million bricks that goes all the way around the estate. So he built that wall. And the interesting thing about the Drax slavery business and their part in it was that it reshaped the lives of enslaved Africans and their descendants, but it also reshaped the lives of indentured servants and local labourers in lots of different ways. It's something that I've been exploring. And the Drax history of connection with Barbados has a really, really long history, and it sort of resounds across continents and across generations as well. And the current owner is Richard Drax, the MP, the Conservative MP, and he still owns plantations in Barbados. And this is one of the plantations on the Drax Hall Estate. Very early on, Colonel Drax, he went there with £300 and he had 28 indentured servants originally. But then after growing tobacco, indigo and cotton, he switched to sugar, and within 10 years, he was the richest plantation owner on the island, and he owned 200 enslaved people. I mean, one of the stories that's not told very often is about the environmental destruction that was wrought by this kind of activity in places like Barbados. And Barbados was deforested by all this activity. And obviously, once it had been deforested, you've got a problem because sugar needs boiling. And in order to boil it, you need fuel. So people would cut down some of the remaining trees on the island, and after that they had to import wood, which was really expensive, or even import coal, or use crushed cane instead. And the soil became exhausted and depleted, and that's when people had to, this is, the really nasty work done by indentured servants and enslaved people would have to manure the land to put some fertility back in it. But this is why I want to mention the story of indentured servants just before I finish in a moment. In that the labour needs were so great that between 1624 and 1750, across the Americas, there were 30,000 indentured labourers who travelled to the region. So one of the issues that I know comes up in Ireland quite a lot is this one. And what about the Irish slaves, or the idea, the concept of Irish slaves? What people mean when they say that is they're referring to indentured servants who went to the West Indies. And there are some important differences, massive distinctions to be made between enslaved people and indentured servants. But indentured servants had a contract, and there was a set number of years that they worked. They were given a lump sum, and at the end that might take the form of land or sugar at the end, depending on the historical period. And there was a description from 1657 in Barbados where it described what would happen when people arrived. They'd arrive on the ships as indentured servants. They'd immediately have to build their own shelters. Then they would work the next day from sunrise. They'd stop at 11 o'clock to have some maize porridge or something like that. And then they would work till sundown. And there were many Irish Catholics brought over as indentured servants. They weren't popular with plantation owners, partly because of the land struggles back home and so on. Some of the indentured labourers were voluntary. In other words, they were impoverished and they thought they might be able to make some money or have a better life. But many were forced, including, say, Irish women in prostitution and so on. But the question is about whether it's accurate to call, in a kind of whataboutery way, to sort of call those people white slaves. It's certainly true that indentured servants were on plantation inventories. The plantation owners could be taxed on their indentured servants. Indentured servants could be used as currency. They could be gambled. They could be left in wills if they still had some years to work out on their contract. And their movements were restricted. They needed permission to leave the plantation, but also they had legal rights in theory, if not always in practice. And in 1661, because of a shortage of indentured labour, there was a law passed to offer certain protections. So, for example, a couple couldn't be split up to work on different plantations and so on. But the difference is, and the important difference to emphasise, is that enslaved people were always trafficked. Their lives were owned, and in the same year, 1661, the so-called slave code legalised chattel slavery. You could be born into chattel slavery. There were vastly different punishments as well. So, for example, if an indentured servant stole something, they might be asked to work an extra year on their contract. You could be put to death or be severely physically punished if you were an enslaved person. But these are important shared and entwined histories, and I think that given the nature of the backlash, it is really, really useful to emphasise the shared nature of these histories in all their nuance. And I'm sure that experts at this conference will explore that. So I just want to finish by going back to the culture war context and to think a little bit about who I kind of who I've turned to understand this culture war a little better, historically, if you like. And one person I found very useful when trying to understand culture wars is actually Martin Luther King, because he describes the culture war almost exactly in certain respects in his sermons particularly. In his day, the onslaught that he was experiencing was to do with the unfinished business of slavery and its failed legacy of emancipation. There's a very interesting new book about that by Chris Manjapra, which I really recommend, about what was wrong with the way in which emancipation happened. But today, it is that kind of resurgent, unfinished business of not just slavery, but colonialism, coming into contact with Britain's own unique historical denial and own unique kind of brand of historical denial. But it's also been useful for thinking back at that question that I asked at the beginning, who are we? What are we here for, and who are we here to serve? Our careers or something bigger? And so I found it really interesting to read a couple of passages from Martin Luther King's sermons, which were, and it's worth remembering that Martin Luther King was widely disliked by white people during his lifetime. But I want to mention some of the things he said, because I have seen again and again a failure of courage in this situation by organisations, by leaders who should be pushing back in more robust ways and not caving in or running away. And this was from one of his sermons. I'll just read it. Soft-mindedness is one of the basic causes of race prejudice. The tough-minded person always examines the facts before he reaches conclusions. In short, he has examined the facts. In short, he prejudges and is prejudiced. In short, he post-judges. Sorry about that. So the tough-minded person always examines the facts before he reaches conclusions. In short, he post-judges. The tender-minded person reaches a conclusion before he has examined the facts. In short, he prejudges and is prejudiced. Too many politicians in the South recognise this disease of soft-mindedness which engulfs their constituency. With insidious zeal, they make inflammatory statements and disseminate distortions and half-truths which arouse abnormal fears, does this sound familiar? And morbid antipathies within the minds of uneducated and unprivileged whites, leaving them so confused that they are led to acts of meanness and violence which no normal person commits. And I think, again, it's really, really interesting to read these words again in a completely different context, but it is a related context. And I think that the wisdom that is in a lot of this writing and these sermons is to do with our approach, because we're in a very toxic environment and we can either add to the toxic environment or we can push through it by having a different strategy. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot in relation to my own experience and the way that I responded and learned to respond to all this kind of barrage of hatred and fear. And I think one of the important things is not to weaponize our knowledge in any way, and to be respectful no matter what. Because, if someone talks to me about engineering, I don't know anything about engineering, so I need someone to resource my understanding about engineering. Obviously there are things we know because we've been studying them for years and years and years. And so we have an advantage, and we also have a position of privilege in many ways. So I'll just read this other passage from, it's to do with a sort of courage as well, where Martin Luther King says in another sermon, Transformed Nonconformist, many people fear nothing more than terribly than to take a position which stands out sharply and clearly from the prevailing opinion. The tendency of most is to adopt a view that is so ambiguous that it will include everything. Many sincere white people in the South privately oppose segregation and discrimination, but they are apprehensive lest they be publicly condemned. And I think it's really important not to be bold and have courage in this situation, because there is no other way through. It's very painful, but that is the only way through. And that's why I keep saying that it's bigger than ourselves, bigger than our careers, bigger than our jobs. And one of the strategically useful things is, that's philosophy, but this is strategy, is understanding why people think what they think and communicating better so that people can have an opportunity to understand history in a different way. It's both an ethical and philosophical position, but it's also about our strategy. And in Martin Luther King's sermons, he did talk about tough-mindedness and tender-heartedness, and he sort of quotes, I mean, I'm getting a bit biblical here, but he quotes from the Bible where he says, he quotes the need to be wise as serpents and tender as doves or something. But I think it was just that combination of the tender-heartedness is about respect, compassion, and just keeping your eye on the larger goal and not getting into unseemly scraps with people where you weaponize your knowledge and make them feel small, which is part of the problem in the first place. So yeah, so that's all. It's a bit of a call to arms, really, to have a bit more courage. But I'll stop there.